The red dot appeared on Cassian Morelli's forehead exactly when the orchestra struck its first chord, a perfect coincidence that would have been poetic if it weren't meant to end his life. He stood on the second-floor balcony of the Savannah Grand Ballroom, surveying 300 guests who believed themselves safe in their designer gowns and rehearsed smiles. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors below, where champagne flutes caught reflections like tiny mirrors, revealing secrets their holders preferred to keep hidden. The annual art charity auction had transformed the ballroom into a gallery of human ambition, each attendee a carefully curated piece. Cassian's hand remained steady on the brass railing, his Italian suit absorbing the warmth of carefully controlled air that smelled of imported roses and old money. He'd attended this event for 7 years, each time watching fortunes change hands over paintings that most buyers couldn't properly appreciate. Tonight felt different in ways he couldn't articulate, a tension beneath the practiced elegance that made his instincts sharpen, like a blade finding its edge. The orchestra played Vivaldi while waiters circulated with precision that would shame military operations, their trays balanced with the expertise of people who understood invisible hierarchies. Below, a woman moved through the crowd with purpose that contradicted the casual grace of her movements, her emerald dress catching light in ways that seemed almost calculated. She stopped at each display podium, adjusting the positioning of information cards with fingers that suggested intimate knowledge of every piece. Her dark hair was swept into a style that belonged in Renaissance paintings, classic without trying to compete with the younger socialites who surrounded her like chattering birds. She consulted a leather portfolio, making notes with a fountain pen that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Cassian recognized efficiency when he saw it, the economy of movement that separated professionals from pretenders in every field he'd ever studied. This woman wasn't performing for the crowd. She was conducting an operation with variables only she could see and outcomes she'd already calculated. She glanced up suddenly, her eyes scanning the balcony with the swift assessment of someone who understood that danger always occupied the high ground. Their gazes met for precisely 2 seconds before she returned her attention to a bronze sculpture that dominated the room's eastern corner. The moment passed without acknowledgement, yet something in that brief connection told Cassian she'd catalogued every detail about him, just as he'd begun cataloging her. He descended the curved staircase with measured steps, nodding to acquaintances whose names he remembered, but whose significance had long since faded into background noise. A state senator grabbed his elbow with the familiarity of someone who believed shared golf games constituted real friendship, launching into complaints about property taxes that Cassian deflected with practiced phrases. He extracted himself near a display of impressionist watercolors, their soft edges contrasting sharply with the hard angles of the evening's unspoken tensions. The woman in emerald now stood beside a collection of pre-Columbian artifacts, her posture suggesting she was simultaneously present and removed from her surroundings. She spoke quietly with an elderly collector whose hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward a jade figurine, his enthusiasm genuine in a room full of calculated interest. Cassian moved closer, pretending to examine a painting that depicted the Savannah harbor at sunrise, all gentle colors and implied promise. From this angle, he could hear fragments of the woman's voice, cultured and calm, with an accent that suggested expensive education rather than geographical origin. "The provenance is impeccable," she was saying, her tone carrying the kind of certainty that ended arguments before they could begin. "I've verified each piece personally through 3 independent sources, including the original acquisition documents from the estate sale." The collector nodded, reassured by her expertise, while Cassian noted the subtle way she'd positioned herself to observe both the main entrance and the service corridors. Most people didn't think about exit strategies at charity galas. Most people didn't need to. A waiter approached with champagne, the bubbles rising in perfect columns that spoke to quality most guests would never consciously notice. Cassian accepted a glass he had no intention of drinking, using it as a prop for the role he played in rooms like this. The woman concluded her conversation and turned, nearly colliding with him in a moment that might have been accidental if her eyes hadn't already known exactly where he stood. She stepped back with a murmured apology that carried no real contrition, only the social lubrication necessary for smooth interactions. "The Monet is a reproduction," she said quietly, nodding toward the painting he'd been pretending to study, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "Excellent work, but the brush strokes in the lower left quadrant betray a modern hand attempting to channel a master's intuition." Cassian shifted his weight imperceptibly, a movement most wouldn't notice, but that changed his angle to the room by crucial degrees, that opened sightlines and tactical options. The woman watched this adjustment, with eyes that understood geometry in ways that transcended art history, her expression remaining pleasant, while calculations ran beneath the surface. "You have a discerning eye, miss," he began, leaving the sentence unfinished in the way that invited completion without demanding it outright. The orchestra transitioned to Mozart, and the crowd's conversation rose to match the tempo change, providing acoustic cover for words that needed privacy. "Rosalind. Alba Rosalind," she supplied, extending a hand that bore calluses in unexpected places for someone whose profession seemed to require only aesthetic judgment. "I'm the curator responsible for tonight's authentication process, which means I'm also responsible for admitting when pieces don't meet our advertised standards." Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, the grip of someone who understood that physical communication often revealed more than verbal exchanges ever could. Cassian held her gaze for a moment that stretched beyond politeness, finding intelligence there that made him recalibrate his initial assessment. "You're saying the auction house is selling forgeries?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the implications that unfolded like origami in reverse, complexity emerging from apparent simplicity. Around them, guests laughed at jokes that weren't funny and complimented outfits they privately criticized, the social machinery grinding forward with relentless momentum. Alba's smile never reached her eyes, which continued their systematic scanning of the ballroom's geography with the patience of someone conducting surveillance. "I'm saying that even rigorous authentication processes occasionally discover inconsistencies requiring immediate disclosure, which I plan to make before formal bidding begins in 20 minutes. She adjusted her portfolio under one arm, the movement drawing his attention to the tension in her shoulders that contradicted her relaxed demeanor. Something was wrong in ways that transcended art fraud, a pressure building beneath the evening's polished surface like water seeking cracks in a dam. "The Renaissance sculptures arrived yesterday from a private collection in Barcelona," Alba continued, gesturing toward 3 marble pieces that dominated the room's western alcove. "Their documentation is flawless, their condition remarkable for pieces allegedly excavated in the 19th century, and their molecular composition suggests climate-controlled storage throughout their existence." Cassian recognized the pattern she was describing, having seen similar schemes in other industries, where authenticity mattered less than perception, and money moved through channels avoiding scrutiny. The sculptures were likely real, but their origins fabricated, creating paper trails that justified prices while hiding actual sources of funds seeking legitimacy. "Money laundering through art acquisition," he said quietly, stating fact rather than asking confirmation, watching her reaction for tells that would reveal whether she was victim or accomplice. "Someone's using the auction to clean cash through inflated purchases, with documentation that makes everything appear legitimate to regulators lacking expertise to question details." Alba's expression flickered with something that might have been relief before she composed herself back into professional neutrality. "The Barcelona collection was brokered through intermediaries I don't recognize, using authentication services that technically exist, but whose experts never physically examined the pieces." She moved toward the sculptures with Cassian following, their progress through the crowd appearing casual while maintaining the focused intensity of people conducting negotiations with consequences. Up close, the marble revealed craftsmanship that spoke to genuine skill, centuries of artistic tradition embodied in stone that had outlived empires. "They're beautiful regardless of their criminal utility," Alba said, her fingers hovering near the surface without quite touching, respecting boundaries even inanimate objects deserved. 15th century Florentine work, probably from a workshop that supplied the Medici family, though proving that connection would require access to private archives in Italy. Cassian studied her profile while she examined the sculptures, noting the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she mentioned the Medici family. That detail meant something personal, a connection that went deeper than professional interest in Renaissance art and extended into territory she wasn't ready to share. "You know who's behind this," he said, making it a statement rather than a question because her body language had already provided the answer. "And you know they're here tonight, watching to ensure their investment passes through the auction without complications that might attract unwanted attention." Alba turned to face him fully for the first time since their introduction, and he saw exhaustion behind the professional mask she wore so skillfully. "Mr. Morelli, I know exactly who you are and what you represent in this city's less visible power structures, which is why I'm going to be direct." The use of his name without him providing it confirmed she'd done research, understood the landscape she was navigating with the thoroughness of someone whose survival depended on accurate intelligence. Cassian felt respect mixing with curiosity, a combination that rarely occurred in his interactions with people who usually wanted something from him or feared what he might take. 3 men entered through the service entrance 40 minutes ago carrying equipment cases that security logged as catering supplies, Alba said, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced him to lean closer. They're positioned in the balcony's northeast corner, the mezzanine level behind the orchestra, and the catering staging area with clear sight lines to where you're currently standing. The information landed like a stone dropping into still water, ripples of implication spreading outward as Cassian processed what she'd just revealed. Professional hits required coordination, multiple shooters ensuring the target couldn't simply move to cover and escape, which meant someone had invested serious resources into ending him tonight. You identified 3 separate positions, he said, his tone remaining conversational while his mind raced through scenarios and countermeasures, which suggests you've been tracking them since they arrived, which further suggests this isn't the first time you've needed to recognize threats in formal settings. Alba's laugh was soft and entirely without humor, a sound that spoke to experiences she'd probably never fully articulate to anyone who hadn't lived similar realities. My father collected rare manuscripts and made enemies of people who believed certain historical documents should remain buried, which taught me early that culture and violence often share the same patrons. She glanced toward the main doors where guests continued arriving in clusters of social obligation and calculated networking, their obliviousness to surrounding danger almost enviable in its simplicity. The orchestra began a new piece, something by Debussy that filled the air with cascading notes suggesting water and moonlight, beauty that existed independent of human corruption. The primary shooter is northeast corner. Second position is redundancy. Third is cleanup in case you manage to reach the exits. Alba continued, her analysis delivered with clinical precision. They're using the auction as cover because crowds provide chaos that aids escape, and because your death during a charity event sends specific messages to specific people. Cassian felt the familiar cold clarity that came when survival required absolute focus, emotions shelved in favor of tactical assessment and immediate action planning. He'd survived 7 years at the top of Savannah's criminal hierarchy by being smarter and more ruthless than people who wanted his position, but someone had clearly decided those advantages no longer outweighed the benefits of his elimination. Who ordered it? He asked, though he already had suspicions based on recent territorial disputes and business arrangements that had dissolved into mutual hostility. Alba's knowledge suggested she had access to information networks that intersected with his own in ways that raised interesting questions about her actual role. The same people who brokered the Barcelona sculptures and need tonight's auction to succeed without complications, she replied, nodding toward an older man in an impeccable tuxedo who held court near the champagne fountain. They believe you've been investigating their operation and plan to interfere with transactions that represent significant investment in establishing legitimate business fronts. The man she'd indicated was Preston Thorne, a real estate developer whose recent expansion into art galleries and auction houses had seemed innocuous, until Cassian's accountants noticed patterns in property transfers that suggested deeper connections. Thorne laughed at something his companion said, the picture of respectable wealth and social standing that masked calculations running parallel to Cassian's own. They're partially correct, Cassian admitted, seeing no benefit in denying what Alba had clearly already deduced through her own intelligence gathering. I've been tracking money moving through art sales because it intersects with shipping contracts and port access that affect my business interests, which makes us accidental allies in opposing the same operation. Alba reached for a passing waiter's tray, selecting 2 champagne flutes with movements that appeared entirely natural to anyone watching from a distance. She handed one to Cassian, raising her own in a toast that positioned them as casual acquaintances sharing pleasantries, while her eyes conveyed urgency that contradicted the relaxed gesture. "Smile like it's a joke," she said clearly, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to hear words that seemed to be finishing some amusing anecdote. Then, barely audible beneath the orchestra's swelling crescendo, she added, "Red dot on your head." Cassian felt rather than saw the laser sight she'd just warned him about, his training recognizing the weight of being targeted even without visual confirmation. He smiled as instructed, the expression reaching his eyes with practiced ease, while his mind catalogued distances, angles, and the precious seconds he might have before someone decided to pull the trigger. The champagne bubbles caught light from the chandeliers, tiny universes of carbonation rising and bursting in patterns that mimicked the chaos of human existence compressed into liquid and glass. He lifted the flute slightly, acknowledging her toast while using the movement to shift his position by inches that might matter when bullets started flying. "Why warn me?" he asked, the question genuine despite his gratitude. because understanding motivations often mattered more than appreciating favorable outcomes. You could let this play out, eliminate a criminal element from Savannah's landscape, and probably earn gratitude from people who consider me a problem requiring permanent solutions. Alba's eyes met his over the rim of her champagne flute, and he saw something there that transcended simple self-interest or moral calculation. Because they told me if I didn't authenticate the sculptures without questions, they'd kill someone I care about, which means we're both trapped in situations orchestrated by people who treat human lives as accounting problems. The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous territory, an offering of trust that created obligations neither had anticipated when this conversation began. Cassian understood leverage and coercion with the intimacy of someone who'd employed both throughout his career, but being on the receiving end alongside someone fighting the same oppression created an alliance that transcended typical criminal cooperation. "After you're dead, they'll have no reason to keep their word about sparing your person," he said, knowing she'd already reached this conclusion, but needing to hear his acknowledgement that he understood her stakes. "Which means your warning isn't altruism. It's desperate strategy from someone running out of options and hoping I represent a better alternative to people currently holding power over your life." Alba's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Appreciation for his directness mixing with the grim humor of people who'd stopped pretending the world operated on fairness or justice. "I'm hoping you're arrogant enough to survive what they've planned, and ruthless enough to ensure they regret backing me into corners." "Yes." Cassian set his champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray with deliberate casualness, the gesture buying him seconds to assess the ballroom's architecture for advantages he could exploit. The northeast corner, where Alba had indicated the primary shooter, featured ornate molding that would provide minimal cover, but created shadows deep enough to obscure precise aim if he could reach that angle. "Dance with me," he said, extending his hand to Alba with the confidence of someone making social overtures rather than tactical maneuvers. She accepted without hesitation, understanding immediately that movement complicated targeting calculations and created unpredictability that might save both their lives. They moved onto the floor, where a dozen couples already swayed to the orchestra's rhythm, their bodies adding layers of human shields between Cassian and the shooters tracking his position. Alba's hand settled on his shoulder with surprising steadiness, her fingers conveying calm that contradicted the danger pressing against them from 3 separate directions. "Preston Thorne is watching us," she murmured, her breath warm against his ear as they turned through the waltz's opening measures. "He's trying to determine if I've warned you, which means he'll signal the shooters to abort if he suspects their advantage is compromised." Cassian guided her into a spin that positioned his back toward the orchestra mezzanine, trusting Alba's earlier assessment that the northeast corner held the primary threat requiring his focused attention. The ballroom's mirrors reflected fractured images of elegance and wealth, surfaces that concealed the violence simmering beneath Savannah's polished exterior like fever beneath cool skin. "How long have they been blackmailing you?" he asked, the question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than strategic necessity, because understanding her situation might reveal vulnerabilities in Thorne's organization. Alba's background suggested resources and connections that didn't align with someone who could be easily coerced unless the leverage was exceptionally personal. 26 months, she replied, her voice carrying the weight of days counted like prison sentences served in expensive clothes and forced smiles. "They discovered my brother's gambling debts to a loan shark operating out of Charleston, debts that would result in permanent physical damage, if not resolved through methods that don't involve conventional payment plans." The admission explained her expertise in recognizing threats and managing dangerous people, skills learned through necessity rather than choice during 2 years of navigating between legitimate art curation and criminal money laundering. Cassian felt the familiar recognition of someone whose life had been hijacked by circumstances beyond their control, forced into compromises that eroded identity until the mirror reflected strangers. "Your brother knows you're covering his debts through criminal activity?" he asked, though the answer mattered less than understanding the complete picture of Alba's constraints. Family loyalty created both strength and weakness, bonds that could be leveraged by people who understood that love often motivated behavior more effectively than fear. Alba's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of pain quickly suppressed beneath the professional mask she'd perfected through years of practice. "He died 8 months ago in a car accident that the police ruled as driver error, though the brake lines had been cleanly cut according to the mechanic's report that never made it into official records." The revelation shifted Cassian's understanding of her situation from coercion to something darker and more permanent, trapped in obligations that had outlived their original purpose. Thorne's organization had eliminated the leverage, but maintained control through implied threats that what happened to her brother could happen to anyone she developed connections with, including curators at galleries she worked with, or colleagues who depended on her professional recommendations. "You've been working to expose them since then," Cassian said, recognizing the pattern of someone gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to deploy information that could destroy the people who'd stolen years from her life. Tonight's auction represents their largest single transaction, which makes it the optimal opportunity to maximize damage while minimizing your exposure to retaliation. Alba guided them toward the ballroom's perimeter, where shadows offered slight concealment from the shooter's sightlines, her tactical thinking matching his own in ways that suggested either training or brutal education through survival. The orchestra transitioned into something by Strauss, the tempo increasing as if the music itself sensed the tension building toward inevitable confrontation. "I've documented every transaction they've forced me to authenticate over 26 months, including purchase records, wire transfers, and communications with buyers who thought they were acquiring legitimate artwork," she said quietly, her words falling into the rhythm of their movement across polished floors. "The evidence is stored in 3 separate locations, with instructions to release everything to federal prosecutors and major media outlets if I miss scheduled check-ins." Cassian admired the thoroughness of her preparation, the kind of detailed planning that separated people who survived dangerous situations from those who only managed temporary escapes before enemies caught up with them. She'd built insurance that made her death more costly than her continued silence, transforming herself from victim into credible threat against people who specialized in eliminating problems. "Which means they're aware you have leverage and are attempting to neutralize both of us before you can deploy evidence that destroys 2 years of careful money laundering," he observed, pieces falling into place with the clarity of a puzzle revealing its complete image. "My death removes the investigative threat to their shipping contracts while creating chaos that lets them eliminate you during the confusion and claim you are collateral damage." The red dot Alba had warned him about earlier flickered across his peripheral vision, a confirmation that the shooter was tracking his movement and calculating optimal firing solutions through the crowd. Cassian adjusted their position subtly, keeping couples between himself and the northeast corner while monitoring Thorne's location near the champagne fountain, where the developer maintained his facade of sophisticated disinterest. 3 minutes until the formal auction begins," Alba said, her internal clock tracking time with the precision of someone who understood that schedules could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The ballroom's energy was building toward the evening's central event, guests positioning themselves near display podiums in anticipation of bidding wars that would determine social hierarchies through proxy battles over artistic masterpieces. Cassian spotted the second shooter's position behind the orchestra, identified by the way one man stood perfectly still, while musicians around him swayed with their instruments' demands. Professional discipline created unnatural calm in environments designed for movement, a tell that separated trained operatives from civilians who knew how to blend into crowds through participation rather than observation. "The Barcelona sculptures are the centerpiece of tonight's auction," Alba continued, guiding him through another turn that kept them mobile and difficult to target with precision. "Preston Thorne has arranged for a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands to win the bidding at exactly $2.3 million, a price that appears competitive without being suspiciously high." The specificity of her knowledge confirmed she'd been deeply embedded in the operation's planning, trusted with details, because Thorne's organization believed her brother's death had ensured permanent compliance through terror. They'd underestimated the possibility that grief could transform into cold determination, that the loss of what they'd threatened to take might free someone to pursue revenge without remaining vulnerabilities to exploit. 2.3 million split across 3 sculptures equals cash absorption that justifies the risk of tonight's operation, Cassian calculated aloud, understanding the economics that drove criminal enterprises with the fluency of someone who'd built empires on similar mathematics. Plus the auction house's commission and the gallery's authentication fees, you're looking at a complete transformation of illegal proceeds into legitimate assets with paperwork that satisfies even aggressive IRS auditing. Alba's eyes tracked movement near the service corridor where the third shooter had positioned himself according to her earlier assessment, her awareness of the tactical landscape suggesting she'd been preparing for this confrontation, longer than just tonight. She'd studied the ballroom's geography, identified escape routes and choke points, and calculated probabilities with the thoroughness of someone who knew that survival required more than hope and luck. The Cayman Corporation is owned by a trust that traces back through 4 layers of legal entities before connecting to Thorn, she explained, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent months untangling financial structures designed to obscure rather than reveal. But the signature on the trust's founding documents belongs to a lawyer who was disbarred in Florida for facilitating drug cartel money laundering, which creates a prosecutable connection if federal investigators follow the trail. Cassian felt grudging respect for her investigative work, the kind of detailed research that required patience and intelligence to navigate deliberately complex systems designed to defeat exactly this kind of scrutiny. She'd built a case that could survive legal challenges, gathering evidence that met evidentiary standards, rather than just assembling suspicions and assumptions that would collapse under cross-examination. You were never planning to authenticate the sculptures tonight, he realized, understanding suddenly that her warning about the shooters was secondary to larger plans already in motion. You were planning to publicly question their provenance during the auction, creating a scandal that would freeze the sale and trigger investigations that would unravel Thorn's entire operation. Alba's smile confirmed his deduction, satisfaction breaking through her carefully maintained neutrality for just a moment before professional caution reasserted control. I was planning to reveal inconsistencies in the molecular dating that suggest the sculptures were treated with modern sealants, incompatible with their alleged 19th century excavation, which would halt the auction pending independent verification that could take months. The orchestra reached a crescendo that signaled the formal program was about to begin, and across the ballroom, Cassian saw Thorn moving toward the stage with the purposeful stride of someone about to make announcements. The developer's expression carried the confidence of someone who believed all variables were controlled, all threats neutralized, and all outcomes aligned with carefully constructed plans. He doesn't know you've been documenting everything, Cassian said, recognizing that Alba's greatest advantage was Thorn's underestimation of someone he'd categorized as a controlled asset rather than an active opponent. He thinks your compliance is guaranteed by fear of what happened to your brother, which means he's about to discover that dead leverage sometimes creates more dangerous enemies than living threats ever could. Alba's grip on his hand tightened almost imperceptibly, a physical acknowledgement of the stakes they both faced in the next few minutes. The auction would either proceed according to Thorn's design with 2 additional bodies joining her brother in premature graves, or it would explode into chaos that exposed criminal enterprises and triggered investigations that would reshape Savannah's power structures. When I reveal the authentication problems, the shooters will receive orders to execute immediately, she said, her tactical assessment delivered with clinical detachment that came from accepting possible death as a cost of pursuing justice. They'll prioritize you first because you represent the physical threat, then target me before I can leave the building with evidence that exists beyond the copies I've already secured. Cassian processed the sequence she'd outlined, recognizing the precision of her analysis and the narrowing window for intervention that would allow either of them to survive what was coming. The ballroom had transformed from elegant social venue into a chessboard where pieces were positioned for endgame moves that would determine who walked away and who became casualties of battles fought in formal wear. Unless we change the board, he said quietly, an idea forming with the clarity that came when survival required abandoning conventional tactics in favor of improvisation. Thorn believes he controls all the variables because he's planned for violence and legal manipulation, but he hasn't planned for public exposure that makes executing either of us more costly than letting us live. Alba's expression shifted from resignation to curiosity, intelligence engaging with possibilities that expanded beyond her original plan for solitary confrontation and likely martyrdom. The orchestra's final notes faded into expectant silence as Thorn reached the microphone, preparing to welcome guests and introduce the evening's charitable purpose with practiced eloquence that disguised criminal enterprise as philanthropic generosity. Cassian released Alba's hand and moved toward the stage with confident strides that drew attention from guests who recognized his name if not his face, his reputation in Savannah's business community providing social capital he was about to spend in ways that couldn't be reversed. Thorn's expression flickered with surprise and calculation. As Cassian approached the microphone, the developer forced to maintain his welcoming smile while his mind raced through implications. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin tonight's auction, I'd like to share some context about the magnificent pieces you'll be bidding on, Cassian said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. He gestured toward Alba, inviting her to join him on stage in a move that positioned them both in maximum visibility, where shooting either would create witnesses no organization could silence. Alba climbed the stage steps with measured grace, her expression composed despite the radical departure from her planned solitary revelation, understanding immediately that Cassian was forcing Thorne to choose between abandoning tonight's operation or exposing himself through violence that couldn't be explained away as random tragedy. The shooters would need new orders, and Thorne would need seconds he didn't have to formulate responses to circumstances spiraling beyond his control. Ms. Rosalind has spent considerable time authenticating the Barcelona collection, and her findings reveal fascinating details about Renaissance craftsmanship that deserve recognition, Cassian continued, yielding the microphone to Alba while positioning himself between her and the northeast corner where the primary shooter maintained his concealed position. His body became a shield that would cost the organization their primary target if they chose to proceed with assassination attempts. Alba's voice was steady when she spoke, years of lecturing about art history, providing foundation for words that carried different weight tonight than they ever had in academic settings. The 3 sculptures you see in the western alcove represent exceptional 15th century Florentine marble work, their craftsmanship consistent with workshops that supplied Europe's most powerful families during the Renaissance period. She moved toward the edge of the stage, her positioning creating angles that would make simultaneous targeting nearly impossible for shooters working from fixed positions, forcing them to choose priorities that would leave one target alive and able to testify. Thorne's face had gone carefully neutral, the developer clearly signaling his people to stand down while he assessed whether this public presentation threatened his interests or could somehow be incorporated into his plans. However, recent molecular analysis revealed traces of polymer sealants applied to preserve the marble's surface integrity, Alba continued, her tone remaining academically professional while delivering information that detonated Thorne's careful arrangements. These sealants were developed in the 1980s and would be entirely absent from sculptures excavated and housed in 19th century European collections, as the documentation claims. The ballroom's atmosphere shifted as guests processed implications they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant, whispers spreading through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Thorne's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, his fury visible to anyone watching closely enough to see past the maintained veneer of sophisticated disappointment, rather than criminal exposure. This doesn't necessarily indicate forgery, Alba clarified, providing Thorne with face-saving alternatives, even while destroying his money-laundering scheme's foundation. It suggests the documentation accompanying these pieces contains errors regarding their storage history, which requires independent verification before the auction can proceed with confidence in the provenance we're advertising to potential buyers. Cassian watched Thorne's hands, knowing the developer would signal his shooters within seconds if he decided that salvaging tonight's operation required eliminating both primary obstacles, regardless of witness complications. But the moment stretched without violence, Thorne clearly calculating that public murder created more problems than postponing financial transactions that could be restructured through alternative channels once attention faded. Given Ms. Rosalind's concerns, I'm proposing the auction proceed with all pieces except the Barcelona collection, Thorne said finally, his voice carrying forced joviality that barely concealed rage simmering beneath professional composure. We'll arrange independent authentication that satisfies everyone's concerns about provenance, ensuring future buyers can bid with complete confidence in their investments. The crowd murmured approval at this reasonable solution, guests appreciating what they perceived as institutional integrity that prioritized accuracy over profit, completely unaware they'd just witnessed criminal enterprise interrupted by unlikely alliance between a curator and a crime boss. Alba returned to Cassian's side at the stage's edge, her relief visible only to someone standing close enough to see the slight tremor in her hands. You just made yourself a permanent target, she said quietly, her words pitched below the crowd's conversational hum as Thorne introduced the evening's first legitimate auction piece. Thorne can't allow you to live, knowing what you know and having demonstrated willingness to interfere with his operations in ways that cost him millions in prepared transactions. Cassian had already accepted this outcome the moment he'd walked toward the stage, understanding that certain decisions transform situations from manageable tension into permanent warfare, where only complete victory or absolute defeat remained as possible endings. Thorne's organization would come for him with everything they had, and survival would require dismantling their entire operation before they regrouped sufficiently to try again. He also can't allow you to live with your documented evidence and proven willingness to expose his schemes publicly, Cassian replied, stating the obvious, because acknowledging shared danger created partnerships stronger than convenience or temporary alliance. which means we're both committed to destroying his organization completely, or dying in the attempt, because there's no longer a middle ground where either of us walks away and resumes normal existence. Alba nodded, her expression settling into the determined calm of someone who'd already accepted death as probable outcome months ago when she began gathering evidence against people who'd murdered her brother. But now she had an ally with resources and expertise that transformed her solitary revenge mission into coordinated warfare with actual possibilities of success, rather than just symbolic gesture before inevitable execution. I have copies of every document stored with 3 different attorneys who have instructions to release everything if I don't check in within 48 hours, she said, providing tactical information that would help Cassian understand the complete situation they were navigating together. But the original documents are in a safety deposit box at Savannah First National, accessible only with my key and biometric identification that can't be easily forged. The auction proceeded with mechanical efficiency, despite the tension crackling beneath polished surfaces, each piece selling to predetermined buyers who'd rehearsed their roles in Savannah's theater of wealth and status. Cassian remained near the stage with Alba, their proximity to Thorn creating a standoff where violence remained possible, but increasingly impractical as witnesses multiplied and attention focused on transactions unfolding under crystal chandeliers. A landscape painting, attributed to a minor Dutch master, sold for $80,000 to a textile manufacturer whose interest in art extended only as far as tax deductions allowed. The crowd applauded politely, their enthusiasm calibrated to match the piece's estimated value rather than any genuine appreciation for 17th century brushwork. Thorn stood at the podium with frozen charm, his announcements hitting every expected note while his eyes tracked Cassian and Alba with the focused intensity of predators calculating attack vectors. The developer had signaled his shooters to maintain positions without executing, buying time to reassess strategies now that simple assassination had been complicated by public exposure and shared knowledge. The next piece is a bronze sculpture by Auguste Rodin, part of a limited casting series completed in 1897, Thorn announced, gesturing toward a figure that captured human form with anatomical precision. Bidding starts at $150,000 with proceeds benefiting the Savannah Arts Education Initiative. Alba leaned closer to Cassian, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered information that added layers to their developing understanding. The Rodin is legitimate, but 3 pieces ago sold to a corporation that exists only on paper. Another method of moving money through art purchases. Cassian nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing the pattern of legitimate transactions mixed with criminal ones, creating cover through volume and variety that made detecting fraud require detailed analysis. Thorn had built an elegant system that exploited the art world's opacity and collectors' desire for discretion in ways that seemed almost respectable until examined closely. The bidding climbed steadily as 2 competing buyers drove the price beyond reasonable market value, their determination suggesting either genuine passion or laundering motivations that transcended aesthetic appreciation. The auctioneer's voice carried practiced excitement that manufactured urgency from what was ultimately just financial transaction, dressed in cultural significance. $220,000 going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel raised in anticipation of the final strike that would seal the sale. $220,000 going twice. $300,000, Cassian said clearly, his voice cutting through the ballroom's ambient noise with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Every head turned toward him, guests registering surprise that someone of his reputation would participate in an auction previously dominated by Savannah's more conventional elite. Thorn's expression flickered through emotions too quickly to catalog individually, settling finally on forced graciousness that barely concealed fury at this additional interference. The developer couldn't refuse a legitimate bid without revealing the auction's actual purpose extended beyond charitable fundraising into carefully orchestrated money laundering. $300,000 from Mr. Morelli, the auctioneer confirmed, professional composure masking whatever confusion he felt about this unexpected development. Do I hear $350,000? The previous bidders remained silent, either recognizing Cassian's reputation and deciding discretion favored withdrawal, or simply lacking resources to compete with someone whose wealth derived from decades of profitable criminal enterprise. The gavel fell with finality that resonated beyond its physical sound, marking a transaction that meant more than bronze sculpture changing ownership. Sold to Mr. Morelli for $300,000, the auctioneer declared, and polite applause rippled through the crowd with the automaticity of people following social scripts. Cassian had just committed significant funds to a purchase that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his willingness to disrupt Thorne's operations through any available method. Alba's hand found his arm, her touch conveying appreciation for the gesture that had further complicated Thorne's evening by introducing variables that couldn't be easily managed. The auction continued with 3 remaining pieces, each selling quickly as if the room collectively desired to conclude business and escape mounting tension that even socially oblivious guests had begun to notice. Final piece of the evening is a collection of illuminated manuscripts from a private monastery library, dating to the 13th century, Thorne announced, his voice showing strain despite professional training. These represent extraordinary examples of medieval craftsmanship, with bidding starting at $200,000. The manuscripts were displayed in climate-controlled cases that protected fragile vellum pages, decorated with gold leaf and mineral pigments that had survived 8 centuries through careful preservation. Alba stiffened beside Cassian, her sudden tension communicating that these pieces carried significance beyond their obvious historical value and artistic merit. Those manuscripts were reported stolen from a private collection in Lyon 18 months ago, Alba whispered urgently, her knowledge of art theft databases revealing yet another layer of criminality woven through tonight's auction. French authorities have been tracking them through underground markets, and their appearance here suggests Thorne's operation extends internationally, with connections to organized theft rings in Europe. Cassian processed this information with the speed of someone trained to identify opportunities within unfolding crises, recognizing that stolen manuscripts represented leverage that transcended local jurisdiction. International art theft triggered treaties and cooperative enforcement protocols that made prosecution significantly easier than money laundering charges, requiring complex financial analysis. "Can you prove they're stolen?" he asked quietly, his mind already formulating plans that required documentation, capable of surviving legal scrutiny rather than just suspicions. Alba's expertise carried weight in authentication disputes, but criminal prosecution demanded evidence chains that met rigorous evidentiary standards designed to prevent wrongful convictions. Alba pulled her phone from a concealed pocket in her dress, fingers moving quickly across the screen as she accessed databases that cataloged stolen artwork. The Lion collection included detailed photographic documentation of every piece, including distinctive aging patterns and repairs that are visible even from here, if you know what to look for. She angled the phone so Cassian could see images matching the manuscripts currently displayed under Thorne's confident presentation, the correlation too precise to represent coincidence. The developer was either spectacularly ignorant of what he was selling or arrogantly confident that no one present would recognize stolen property hidden among legitimate auction pieces. "Bidding is at $350,000, the auctioneer announced, his rhythm unbroken despite the evening's earlier disruptions, professional momentum carrying the auction toward conclusion. "Do I hear $400,000 for this exceptional collection of medieval manuscripts?" Cassian raised his hand, the gesture drawing immediate attention from guests who'd already noted his earlier disruption of expected patterns and wondered what additional interference he planned. Thorne's jaw clenched visibly, the developer clearly reaching limits of patience that had been tested repeatedly throughout an evening that had deviated catastrophically from careful planning. $400,000 from Mr. Morelli, the auctioneer confirmed, his professional neutrality starting to show cracks, as he recognized patterns suggesting something more complex than typical bidding competition. "Do I hear $450,000? Silence stretched across the ballroom as previous bidders declined to compete with someone whose motivations had become inscrutable and whose resources seemed sufficient to overwhelm conventional collecting budgets. The manuscripts would sell to Cassian unless Thorne chose to intervene directly, abandoning his carefully maintained distance from auction mechanics that preserved plausible deniability. "Going once at $400,000, the auctioneer called, following protocols that would complete the sale and transfer ownership in ways that became legally binding once the gavel fell. "Going twice at $400,000, $500,000, Thorne said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with forced casualness that failed to conceal desperation driving his unprecedented direct participation. The developer had just revealed how much the manuscripts mattered by abandoning his observer role and competing openly for pieces he'd arranged to sell through predetermined buyers. Alba's breath caught as she recognized the implications of Thorne's bid, understanding that the manuscripts represented more than just valuable stolen property, but served some function in his organization. The evening had transformed from controlled money laundering into improvised damage control, as variables multiplied beyond anyone's ability to manage simultaneously. 600,000, Cassian countered immediately, his escalation communicating that he understood the manuscript's significance and intended to prevent Thorne from recovering pieces that clearly mattered. The ballroom had gone completely silent, guests recognizing they were witnessing confrontation that transcended normal auction competition and entered territory where personal animosity and power struggles played out through financial proxy warfare. Thorne's face had gone rigid with barely suppressed fury, his composure finally cracking under accumulated frustrations of an evening that had systematically destroyed months of planning. He opened his mouth to counter Cassian's bid, then visibly reconsidered as he calculated the attention that continued escalation would draw from guests already sensing something abnormal about the evening's progression. "Sold to Mr. Morelli for $600,000, the auctioneer declared after waiting the customary interval for competing bids that never materialized. The gavel fell with finality that seemed to reverberate beyond its physical sound, marking the auction's conclusion and the beginning of whatever came next in the confrontation that had been building throughout the evening. Applause rose from the crowd with mechanical politeness, guests following social scripts even as they exchanged puzzled glances and whispered speculations about the unusual dynamics they'd witnessed. Thorne descended from the stage with rigid control, his path carrying him directly toward Cassian and Alba, with the inevitability of gravitational forces pulling celestial bodies into collision. "That was quite a performance, Mr. Morelli," Thorne said when he reached them, his voice pitched low enough that surrounding guests couldn't overhear the venom carried beneath words. "I hope you're prepared to actually complete the purchases you've committed to, as our auction house takes payment obligations seriously and has legal recourse for buyers who bid without genuine intent." Cassian met Thorne's gaze with calm that came from decades of navigating threats both subtle and explicit, his expression revealing nothing about the calculations running behind professional neutrality. "I have certified funds available for immediate transfer, and I'm quite looking forward to taking possession of pieces that deserve proper appreciation and careful preservation in collections that respect their historical significance." The emphasis on proper appreciation and preservation carried implications that Thorne couldn't miss, coded language communicating that Cassian understood exactly what he'd purchased. Alba remained silent beside him, her presence reinforcing the alliance that had formed organically through shared opposition to Thorne's criminal enterprise. "Ms. Rosalind, I trust you'll be available tomorrow to discuss your concerns about the Barcelona collection's authentication," Thorne continued, shifting his attention to Alba. "We'll need detailed documentation of your molecular analysis to arrange the independent verification I announced earlier, and I'm sure you understand the importance of thoroughness." Alba's expression remained composed despite the implied threat woven through Thorne's words, her experience with his organization providing fluency in reading subtext that most people would miss. "Of course, Mr. Thorne. I maintain comprehensive records of all authentication work, and I'm happy to provide whatever documentation supports proper verification processes." Thorne's smile was sharp enough to draw blood, his fury barely contained beneath social conventions that required maintaining appearances even when situations had deteriorated beyond salvage. He nodded to both of them with exaggerated politeness before turning away, his exit from the conversation marking temporary withdrawal rather than strategic surrender or acceptance of defeat. "He'll move against us tonight," Alba said once Thorne had departed, her tactical assessment delivered with certainty born from months of studying his patterns. "The shooters are still positioned, and he's just signaled them to proceed once we leave the ballroom's public space and enter areas where violence can be executed without immediate witnesses." Cassian had reached the same conclusion, recognizing that Thorne's organization couldn't allow either of them to survive with the knowledge and evidence they possessed. The developer would commit whatever resources necessary to eliminate threats before they could deploy information that would trigger investigations destroying everything he'd built. "My security team is positioned at all vehicle access points with instructions to escort us safely from the premises," Cassian said, pulling his phone to send encrypted messages. "And I have a safe location where we can plan our next moves without worrying about immediate assassination attempts." Alba hesitated for just a moment, clearly weighing her options and recognizing that accepting Cassian's protection meant fully committing to partnership that would reshape her life. Then she nodded, decision made with the finality of someone who understood that survival sometimes required trusting people whose backgrounds would normally inspire caution rather than confidence. They moved toward the ballroom's main exit together, maintaining casual postures that belied their awareness of danger, tracking their movement through spaces that had transformed from elegant venue into battlefield. Other guests were departing in clusters, their conversations focused on auction results and social observations that missed entirely the life-and-death struggles unfolding in parallel to their comfortable existence. Cassian's security team materialized from various positions as they approached the entrance. 6 men whose tailored suits couldn't quite conceal the athletic builds and tactical awareness that marked them as professionals. They formed a loose perimeter that appeared casual to observers, but created overlapping fields of observation and response capability that would counter threats from multiple vectors simultaneously. The night air hit them as they exited the ballroom, carrying humidity that promised rain before morning, and temperatures that made formal wear uncomfortable after the building's climate control. 3 black vehicles idled at the curb with engines running and doors already opening to receive them, the precision of the operation speaking to training and preparation that had anticipated exactly this kind of emergency extraction. Alba started toward the lead vehicle, then paused and turned back to Cassian, with an expression that carried vulnerability she'd carefully concealed throughout the evening's tensions. Her hand reached out tentatively, not quite touching his arm, but hovering in the space between them with uncertainty that transcended tactical considerations and entered territory where human connection mattered more than strategic advantage. "I don't know what happens next," she said quietly, her voice carrying exhaustion from 2 years of forced compliance and months of planning revenge that had finally manifested. "I don't know if we survive what's coming or if Thorne's organization destroys us before we can destroy them, but I know I can't do this alone anymore." Cassian saw in her eyes the same isolation he'd felt throughout decades of building criminal enterprises that required trusting no one completely and maintaining emotional distance that protected against betrayals. But standing here with someone who understood the weight of choices made under impossible circumstances, he recognized possibility for something different than the solitary existence he'd accepted as necessary cost of survival. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, until her hand settled against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat beneath expensive fabric and accumulated scars. "Stay," he whispered, the single word carrying more weight than elaborate speeches could ever convey. Vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to express, breaking through defenses built over decades of calculated self-preservation. "Please." Alba's eyes searched his face for deception or manipulation, finding instead genuine request from someone who'd learned that power and control couldn't substitute for actual human connection. She nodded slowly, decision settling across her features, with the kind of peace that came from finally stopping the exhausting performance of pretending strength meant never needing anyone. They entered the vehicle together as his security team secured the perimeter, doors closing on the ballroom behind them, while unknown battles waited ahead in the war they'd just declared. But for this moment suspended between past trauma and future uncertainty, they'd found something neither had expected, an alliance that transcended tactical necessity and approached the kind of trust that made survival feel worth the effort required to achieve it. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until next time, stay safe out there.